Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the coldest, most unforgiving realities you've probably never really imagined what it took to survive a single winter night as a Victorian peasant. Picture the romanticized cobbled streets and the warm glow of gaslight? Forget all that. Tonight, you're going to wake up on a lice-ridden straw mattress, shivering under a threadbare sackcloth, bones aching from the cold that has seeped all the way in. Your breath fogs the air indoors. You're not in a Dickens novel, you're in the part no one writes about. The smells will gag you, the cold will crawl inside you. And hunger? That's not a metaphor, it's a gnawing, constant pressure behind your ribs. Because, here's the truth, the picturesque England of Queen Victoria's reign was a hellscape if you were born poor. Winters weren't just cold, they were lethal. If the cold didn't take you, disease might. If not disease, starvation. And if you somehow scraped through, the debt collectors, the parish guardians, or the workhouse would be waiting. Victorian poverty wasn't just uncomfortable, it was engineered. Tonight, we're not talking about lords and parlours. We're crawling through the frostbitten underbelly of empire. And by the end of this journey, you'll never complain about a chilly morning again. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's 5:42 in the morning. You wake up because you're shivering so hard it hurts. Not in a cozy way, not the kind of shiver you can tuck under a duvet and laugh about. This is the kind of shiver that clenches your jaw until your molars ache, the kind that makes your joints feel like they're cracking apart. You open your eyes and it's still pitch black. There's no lamp to flick on. There's no central heating. There's no insulation. Your breath drifts visibly in the freezing air and settles in pale, ghostly clouds above your face. You lie beneath two damp patchwork blankets made of rags stitched together over the years one still has a crust of dried vomit from your youngest's last fever. The mattress under you is lumpy, thin, stuffed with straw and fleas, and the whole room smells like mould, smoke, and old cabbage. There's a mouse in the corner again. It scuttles over the floorboards, slipping past the broken bits of ceramic where the chamber pot cracked last winter. You haven't replaced it. You just squat by the door now. Everybody does. Your hands itching, stiff air the first thing you check. No frostbite, not yet. You flex your fingers and try to feel your toes. Numb. But they're there. That's good enough. For now, you sit up, wrap yourself in the coat you slept. In same one you'll work, in and tiptoe past the other bodies. Your husband's breath is loud and wet from his cough. He might not get up today. That cough's been lingering. Your two children are curled up on either side of him for warmth, their faces pale, noses crusted, hair matted. You haven't been able to wash anything properly in weeks. The floor is stone ice cold against your bare feet. You tread lightly, stepping around a rat trap you set the night before. It's empty, snapped and clean. No luck, maybe tomorrow. You go to the hearth. It's dead cold. You kneel and start to rebuild it, one-handed at first as the other clutches a bit of last night's half-burned coal and a twist of damp paper from under the bed. You strike the flint. Once, twice, a dozen times. The cold makes it harder. Eventually, it sparks. The kindling catches. A thread of smoke curls upward. You're careful too much smoke, and the landlord's steward might accuse you of burning scavenged wood again. Not that they need a reason to fine you. The fire crackles weakly, You lean in. For a moment it feels like your nose is thawing. You spoon out the last of the porridge into a cracked tin, pot-watery, grey, spiced only with desperation. No sugar. That's a luxury. You heat it over the flame. It smells faintly of charred oats and metal. You don't taste it, you save it for the children. Your stomach growls, loudly. You fill your mouth with cold water from the bucket by the door. It tastes like dirt and iron. It's icy and it hurts going down. You swish it, swallow, and pretend that's breakfast. Time to dress the children. Both are coughing, both are hungry. You bundle them into their only layers, stiff wool, too small for their frames, patched dozens of times. You tie your daughter's shoes with twine. Her toes still peek through. You check the bucket again. The water level's low. You'll have to fetch more from the public pump before the sun rises, before the lines form. It's 3 streets down. It'll take half an hour. Longer if your boots leak, and they do. You knock on the wall to wake your neighbour. She owes you half a sack of coal from last week's shared ration. You can hear her stirring then, the scrape of a chamber pot, a baby crying. You wrap a scarf around your mouth and step outside. The air bites, fog rolls low over the ground. The street is silent, except for the distant bark of dogs and the clatter of a cart's wheels. You pass shuttered shops, closed chapels, and a row of tenements where every window glows faint orange from struggling fires. A boy runs past barefoot. He's maybe 6. His breath is fast. He's clutching something, a potato maybe? You don't call after him. You're not a fool. The pump is already occupied by 2 women. One is old, hunched, her shawl worn so thin it looks translucent. The other is too young to be out alone. Her hand is red and swollen, wrapped in a bloody rag. She nods at you, doesn't speak. You fill your bucket. You carry it home. It sloshes, spills, soaks your dress. You grit your teeth. You keep walking. Because what else is there? Inside, the fire's almost out again. You drop in a bit of coal. It sparks reluctantly. You call your children to the hearth, feed them the porridge, and kiss their heads. You pray, not because you believe, but because the ritual helps. You mouth the words without feeling. You ask for strength, warmth, and a break in the wind. Your husband groans from bed. His face is flushed now, his lips cracked. He mumbles something about his lungs. You hand him the last of the tea from 2 nights, aggo cold, bitter, medicinal. He sips it with shaking hands. By 9 a.m, you're out again. You'll beg for laundry, maybe scrub floors. You walk to the factory gate. Maybe someone didn't show. Maybe you'll be lucky. Your coat doesn't block the wind. Your stomach's empty. You haven't smiled in 3 days. And winter's only just begun. You learn to survive the cold like an animal through instinct, habit, and the brutal grinding repetition of what works just well enough to avoid death. You don't fight the cold. You fold into it, learn its rhythm. You become smaller, slower, quieter. It's not about comfort, it's about not dying. There's a difference. The first thing you do every day, without fail-less ration warmth, you divide it in your mind, like others divide bread. If you're lucky enough to have a fire, it gets divided into 3 categories: mornings to thaw, evenings to cook, and nights to sleep. Nothing in between. If it burns too fast, you'll freeze before sunrise. If it goes out, it may never come back. Your fire is everything. It's a hearth, yes, but also a ward against pneumonia, frostbite, rats, and spirits if you believe in those. You gather fuel from wherever you can. Scrap wood, broken crates, horse dung dried in the alley, dead branches, anything that burns. Coal is ideal, but expensive. Peat is a blessing if you can steal it, but the worst part? You have to burn slow, let it smolder, make it last. That means less light, less heat, more smoke. You choke on it daily, eyes streaming, but you sit in it like it's a balm. You learn how to layer, not in the fashionable way, in the desperate way. You wrap rags around your calves, stuff old cloth into the lining of your sleeves. Use threadbare socks on your hands if you have no mittens. You wear your coat indoors and out. If the seams split, you sew them with coarse thread, often while it's still on your body. A shirt is never just a shirt, it's a second skin you dare not remove. Some nights you sleep in your boots, not for safety, just to keep your feet from turning blue. Your nights are the worst, always. Sleep is a gamble. You either drift off into shallow, twitching dreams full of shivering and wake gasping, or you don't sleep at all and pass the hours staring at the ceiling, praying the wind dies down. Some nights you think about letting the fire burn out, just to see what happens. But you don't, you never do, because you've seen what happens. You remember old Mrs. Dobbins, 3 doors down, last winter didn't wake up. They said it was natural causes, but you remember her skin, pale, blue, frozen like a fishmonger's catch. Sometimes you huddle with your children under the same blanket, not for affection, but strategy. Human heat is the only free warmth left. You tuck them under each arm, position them like coals in a dying fire, and try not to think about how thin they've gotten. And when the cold gets really bad, when the frost on the inside of the window thickens into opaque white, when the fire refuses to catch, when your breath feels like it might crystallize in your throat, that's when you start the rituals. You boil water you don't have to drink, just to create steam, just to pretend. You heat stones in the fire, then wrap them in cloth and tuck them near your body, or the baby's body, or the feet of whoever looks worst. The stones sometimes crack. Once, one burned a hole clean through a blanket, but you still do it because it helps. You rub your hands together constantly, not for warmth, but to check. If you stop feeling your fingertips, that's a warning. Numbness is the first sign. Pain is good. Pain means you're still alive. You watch your toes too. Check them at night. Look for colour. Rub them hard. If they turn waxy, you panic. There's no doctor. Not for people like you. Doctors cost more than rent. If something goes wrong, a limb, a fever, a lung infection, you go to the apothecary and ask for the cheapest thing they've got. Usually it's gin, or opium drops, or turpentine mixed with syrup and hope. So you avoid getting sick. You sleep with your mouth covered. You wrap your feet even inside the house. You boil the same socks every few nights, not to clean them, but to kill what's crawling in them. You breathe shallow. You move slow. Even bathing becomes strategic. Not just because water is scarce, but because removing your cleidheson for 5 minutes can cost you. You dry wash. Use a damp rag and vinegar. You clean only what's necessary. Armpits, face, between the toes. You never let your head stay wet for long. That's suicide. And then there's the hunger. The way it sharpens the cold. You can't tell which is worse, the gnawing stomach or the frozen skin. Hunger makes you shiver harder. Cold makes you hungrier. It's a vicious loop. You eat what you can. Stale bread softened in broth, root vegetables, bits of boiled cabbage. Sometimes just the water cabbage was boiled in. Once you boiled a piece of leather. Tried to chew it like meat. You were hungrier afterward. You beg for bones at the butcher. You chew the cartilage. You boil the marrow. You add flour to thin soups and pretend it's filling. If you're really desperate, you go to the church and ask the vicar for charity. He'll give you a penny if you say the right things. Or he won't. Depends on the mood. And still, through all of this, you work. You haul laundry through frozen streets, fingers bleeding from the soap. You clean ash from hearths that burn hotter than yours ever could. You scrub chamber pots with frozen water and a rag wrapped around a stick. You sell matches, polish boots, sit in doorways holding your sick baby and hope someone feels pity. You do whatever keeps the shillings trickling in. You learn tricks to keep moving. Pinch your thighs through your skirts. Clench your fists rhythmically. March in place while waiting in lines. Keep the blood flowing. Stillness is your enemy. Some nights you talk about emigrating. To Canada, maybe, or America. Places where the streets are paved with opportunity. But you know better. You've seen the ships. You've heard the screams from steerage. You stay. Because at least you know this cold. At least it's a familiar enemy. And through it all, you pretend. You tell your children spring is coming. You smile when they ask if they can play outside. You sing songs at night, even though your throat burns. You pray, not for deliverance, but for endurance. Because you don't expect the world to change. You just need to make it one more day. And tomorrow, you'll do it all again. There are only 3 things you can count on to keep your body and mind stitched together through these endless cold days. Something warm to eat, something hot to burn, and anything to believe in. Food first. But food is too generous a word for what you actually eat. It's more like strategy, like patching a leaking roof with twine and mud. It's not about flavor or fullness, it's about survival math. Calories, warmth, gut weight. You eat to trick your stomach into silence for another few hours. You eat to move your limbs. You eat to avoid fainting in the street and waking up in a parish infirmary, branded as a beggar. You scavenge where you can. The market stalls toss rotten vegetables into the street after dark. You wait until the vendors aren't looking, and you pick through the pile. Soft onions, cabbage cores, bruised turnips with white threads of mould creeping into the skin. You slice that part off with a bit of broken blade and pretend you don't notice the rest. Bread is a miracle, even a crust. Even the dry, crumbly end of a loaf bought 3 days ago and gnawed at through shaking hands. If you're lucky enough to afford flour, you mix it with water and lard just enough to hold it together and drop lumps onto a hot plate above the hearth. You tell the children it's a cake. They laugh, mouths already dry. Meat? That's rare. If you're working laundry for a butcher's family, maybe they let you take home the offal. You don't ask what it is. You boil it until the smell softens and try not to look too closely at the grey froth. Bone broth is gold. You scrape marrow, crush garlic if you can steal a clove, boil it all day until the kitchen smells like something close to comfort. But mostly, you live on cabbage, potatoes, and hope. When you do have something special, a half sausage, a spoon of jam, a slice of cheese, you portion it like treasure. 1 bite for each child, maybe a lick for you, maybe not. And tea, God, the tea. The ritual of it is worth more than the flavour. The hot water, the steeped leaves. It doesn't matter if it's already been used 3 times. You reuse the same bag, dry it on the mantle, and trick yourself into believing it's still strong. Sometimes you don't even have tea, just hot water and a bit of ash to give it colour. But when you wrap your hands around the mug, it feels like medicine. Then there's fire. Fire is your obsession, your anchor, your currency. Without it, everything collapses. You think about fire constantly, where to find fuel, how to make it last, how much to save for the night. You even dream about it sometimes. Not flames, just warmth. The way it feels when your skin stops hurting. The way the room changes when the light flickers gold instead of grey. You time your days around that hearth. You light it as late as you dare in the morning, just enough to thaw the bucket and boil water for your husband's aching chest. Then you smother it, let it rest. Feed it tiny bit scraps of coal, old cork, twisted paper, just enough to keep a glow under the ash. You've learned to cook on embers, not flames. Flames are wasteful, embers are reliable. You spread out the coals and use bits of broken iron for a pan. You burn your fingers often, but you've gotten used to the sting. On good days, you share fire with the woman next door. Her husband is dead. Yours is dying. Between the two of you, you scrape together enough for one solid burn. You sit together on crates, wrapped in shawls, not speaking much, just listening to the pop of heat and watching the shadows move across the floor. Some people have fireplaces in every room. You've seen them through windows, gleaming grates, real mantles, logs stacked neatly nearby. In those homes, fire is a decoration, an indulgence. In yours, it's a lifeline, a slow-breathing animal that demands your attention, your respect, and everything you can afford to feed it. And when the fire goes out, really out, it's like someone's stolen your lungs. The walls close in, your hands shake. You wrap yourself in every piece of cloth you own and pray the embers survive long enough to be coaxed back to life by morning. Because once it's gone, you're done. And then there's faith. Not church, not really. The church is complicated. The vicar speaks of compassion, but only for those who tithe. He lectures from the pulpit about God's plan, while the children of the parish cough blood in the pews. You don't trust the church, not entirely, but you cling to the idea of it. You go because the routine matters, because kneeling in the cold stone nave gives your legs a purpose, because the hymns remind you of your mother, because sometimes the sermon warms you in ways the fire can't. You don't always believe, but you need to. You whisper prayers before bed, for warmth, for food, for less coughing, for a Sunday without shame. And when your faith wavers, you find other things to believe in. Superstitions, routines, the way your daughter arranges her doll's hair every morning, the pattern of soot across the bricks, the exact number of steps it takes to walk to the pump and back. Little sacred things, talismans of order in a world that feels engineered for your erasure. You believe in other people, too. Sometimes. You believe in the widow who gives you half her bread when she catches you crying outside the coal depot. You believe in the factory girl who lets you warm your hands near her lamp while the overseer's turned away. You believe in kindness, in scraps. And when belief isn't enough, you pretend. You tell your children stories about spring, about green grass and birdsong. You tell them the Queen cares, that she thinks about families like yours, that one day, maybe, you'll have a home with a real bed and curtains, that there are places where no one freezes. You tell yourself that, too. And it almost feels true, because without these things, food, fire, and faith, you are nothing. You are another body under a blanket, another frozen face in an alley, another name scrawled in a death ledger and buried in a pauper's grave. So you cling. You scrape your fingers across the brick of life and hold on. You patch every wound with cabbage broth and whispered hymns and the smell of burning coal, and you endure. because the world doesn't care if you live or die. But your children do. You don't think about water the way others do. Not as a drink, not as a luxury, not even as clean. You think of it as a risk, a necessity, yes, but also a gamble. Every morning starts with a decision. Haul the bucket now and face the wind, or wait until the queue at the public pump gets long and the water runs cloudy with rust and rat droppings. You choose early, always. The fewer eyes, the less competition, less chance of the handle freezing or the flow slowing to a trickle. You carry a tin pail with a dented side and a handle that bites into your palm. It clatters when it's full, sloshes ice cold down your wrist. Some mornings the pump is frozen solid. Then it's a waiting game, cupping your hands around the metal, breathing on it, smacking it with a stone, praying for just enough thaw to get it moving again. If it doesn't, you knock on a neighbour's door and beg, or steal. You use that water for everything. Washing, cooking, drinking, boiling rags, rinsing out wounds. 1 bucket, 10 uses. No one drinks it straight, not unless they're desperate. You boil it when you can, or pour in vinegar when you can't. Once, you let it sit overnight in the sun, thinking maybe that helped. You don't know why. Someone told you once. You'll believe anything if it doesn't kill you. The smell of the pump water changes week to week. Sometimes it's just iron. Other times it's something worse, like sewage or rot or the unmistakable tang of death. But it's still water, still better than rain runoff or melted snow from the gutters or the black slime that leaks from the tenement roof when the frost starts to thaw. You keep it in a ceramic jug by the hearth, the same jug you use to soak feet, the same jug you pour into the wash basin for laundry. You don't separate things like people with money do. There's no water for bathing and water for tea. It all comes from the same cracked jug. Illness, meanwhile, is as common as breath. You can't avoid it. You just learn to live alongside it, like a ghost that watches from the corner, waiting. It starts with a cough, always, harmless at first, dry. You ignore it. Everyone coughs. The coal smoke alone guarantees it. But then it deepens, wettens, turns into something with a rhythm, a presence, the kind of cough that rattles your ribs. You wake up with it in your ears, feel it vibrate through the mattress as your husband hacks into the night. There are no doctors not for you. You'd have to sell your coat for a visit, and he wouldn't come anyway, not to this part of town. Not unless he's being paid triple, and even then he'd hold a handkerchief over his nose and leave within 10 minutes. So you become the doctor. You learn to read symptoms like weather patterns. If the phlegm's yellow, it's passing. Green means infection. Blood means fear. You smell your children's breath while they sleep. Touch their cheeks in the dark. Feel their foreheads for heat. Count the seconds between their wheezes. You keep track without even thinking. Like breathing. Like prayer. Your pharmacy is a wooden box under the bed. Inside, a cracked jar of goose fat. A tin of menthol paste from 2 winters ago. A bottle of vinegar. A few scraps of ginger. A brown bottle with no label and a cork jammed in tight. It might be opium tincture, or cough syrup, or poison. You use it sparingly. You don't have the luxury of certainty. You boil onion skins and make them drink the water. You mash garlic into hot broth and spoon it in, whether they gag or not. You rub mustard paste onto chests, wrap them in old sheets, and lay hot bricks near their feet. You burn herbs in the corners of the room, not because they work, but because the smell makes you believe they might. Sometimes you take them to the apothecary, if you have a few pennies and the desperation outweighs your shame. He sells you powders in folded paper, bottles with instructions you can't read. He tells you to take just a drop, but you double it. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it makes them vomit. You still do it, because something is better than nothing. You've seen enough people die to know what it looks like. The fever that burns too long, the cough that doesn't stop, the stomach pain that turns to screaming, then silence. You know the signs. And still you fight. You brew teas. You scavenge for nettle, for fennel, for elderberry bark. You pound roots with a brick and pack them into cloth like poultices. You whisper to your children while they sweat through their clothes. You're strong. You'll be better soon. Mama's here. Sometimes you lie. When it's you who gets sick, you hide it. You keep moving. You can't afford to collapse. If you rest, everything falls. No water fetched, no work done, no bread bought. You take your medicine in the form of silence and steam and sheer refusal. You will yourself upright. You smile at your children through cracked lips and blood-rimmed eyes. They don't need to know. Death is a frequent visitor in your neighborhood. It moves quietly, quickly, takes babies first, then old men, then women who work too hard for too long. Sometimes it takes them in sleep. Other times, it drags them down over weeks, wasting their limbs, hollowing their faces. You hear the screams through the wall, the coughing through the floorboards, the wails after midnight when someone realizes they're a widow or childless or next. And the burial process is not what it should be. No funerals, no flowers, no mourning clothes. Just a cart that comes on Thursdays and hauls the wrapped bodies to the pauper's trench. A thin priest with cold hands and an even colder prayer, and then dirt. You pray, not because you think it helps, but because it's what's left. You ask God to spare you, or at least spare your children. You tell yourself your love will keep them warm, that your care will be enough, that the poultices matter, because if they don't, then nothing does. You survive not by conquering illness, but by dodging it long enough for spring to arrive, by treating your body like a battlefield. You ration your strength, you pace your breathing. You become intimate with the smell of infection, the sound of a death rattle, the moment a fever breaks. You wait out the storm inside your own lungs. And when one of yours does fall ill, really ill, you sit beside them, holding their hand, pressing rags to their head, whispering things you don't believe. You try to buy time. That's all illness is here, a debt you delay until your body has nothing left to pay with. And if the worst happens, you do what all poor mothers do. You wash the body, wrap it in linen, and keep going. Because you have no choice. You don't live in a home. You live in a structure that barely keeps the world out. A lean-to, a shack, a borrowed corner of someone else's crumbling building. A space the landlord calls a dwelling. But the rats have claimed it more honestly than you ever could. There's no insulation, no plaster. The walls sweat in the summer and grow icicles in the winter. The roof leaks like a bad wound. It cries whenever the wind shifts. Your room is 8 feet by 10, not that you've measured. You just know that when you stretch out your arms, you touch 2 opposite walls. And when you stand in the center, you can see every miserable thing you own. 1 low bed, a fireplace full of soot, a shelf with 2 cracked cups, a basket for coal that's usually empty, and a single chair that groans when anyone sits on it. No curtains, just rags nailed to the window frame. They let in the wind anyway. You keep them up to keep the eyes out, not that anyone wants to look in. The floors are stone or packed dirt, depending on the season. Either way, your feet are always cold. The front door doesn't quite latch. You tie it shut with a bit of rope. It's been kicked in before once by collectors, once by a drunk neighbour who thought it was his own home, and once by a constable looking for someone who wasn't you. You don't argue anymore. You just open it when they knock and hope they don't take something vital. The walls are thin enough to hear everything next door. You've heard love, grief, childbirth, death all through the same crack in the plaster. You hear people cough, cry, beg for forgiveness. You hear them die, then silence, then someone else moves in, and the cycle starts again. Your ceiling is speckled with black mould. It creeps in from the corners like a slow rot. You tried scrubbing it once with lye and vinegar, but it came back thicker, darker. You're not sure if it makes you sick, or if you're just always sick now. You stopped trying to tell the difference. But it's not the decay that makes shelter fragile. It's the people inside it. You try to hold your family together, like the roof tries to hold back rain. Patch after patch, crack after crack. You become the beam, the glue, the latch. The firemaker, the scavenger, the nursemaid, the liar, the shield. Your husband used to be strong. A cobbler's apprentice. He had hands like stone and a back that could lift a cartwheel. Now his breath comes wet and rattling. He coughs until he vomits, then sleeps for 12 hours and wakes up looking older. You try to feed him broth. He thanks you with his eyes but barely touches the cup. You love him, but that love bends under the weight of the cold, the hunger, the endless struggle. Sometimes you're angry, furious, at his weakness, at his silence. At the way he watches you sweep and boil and sew and bury your own illness in the pit of your stomach without saying a word. But then he smiles, just once, and you remember the man who danced with you on market night 4 winters ago, the man who held your face and said you were the most beautiful thing in a city full of statues. That man is still in there. You see him sometimes, flickering behind the fever. Your children are too young to know what they've missed. They think cabbage is a feast. They think 2 blankets is luxury. They don't cry over missing toys or holidays or ribbons. They cry when the fire goes out. When the rats chew through their shoes. When their fingers bleed from the cold. You teach them to smile anyway. You tell them stories while they shiver. Stories about brave girls and clever boys who find treasure in chimneys and maps under floorboards. You make them laugh while scrubbing lice from their scalps. You sing while sewing patches onto their trousers. You turn every broken object into a game, every hole in the roof into a star map, every crack in the wall into a secret door. Because what else can you give them? You can't promise safety, or health, or a future, but you can give them belief in you, in warmth, in the idea that love is stronger than hunger. And then, sometimes, love fails. There are nights your temper snaps, when the baby won't stop screaming and the stew boils over and someone spills the last of the flour, when the cold has made your hands numb and your breath tastes like rust, when you slam your hand on the table and shout words you can't take back, when your children flinch, when your husband turns away, and you hate yourself. You cry in silence after they've gone to sleep. You press your face into the mattress to muffle the sound. You promise you'll be better tomorrow. Then tomorrow comes, and you do it all again, because you must. The city doesn't care if you break. The landlord doesn't care if you weep. The constable doesn't care if you vanish. No one is coming to save you. No one is watching. No one is counting your efforts, except the children, who will remember the shape of your hands for the rest of their lives. So you endure. You make that tiny room into a fortress. You defend it against the cold, the sickness, the despair. You hold your husband's hand when he's too weak to speak. You braid your daughter's hair, even when your own fingers bleed. You hum lullabies that your mother sang to you, even though she died last year from the very same cough that's creeping into your husband's lungs. You keep the hearth burning. You guard it like a sacred flame. You sit with your back to the door and your eyes on the coals, listening to the world crash outside. And through it all, you tell yourself, this is a home. It's not strong, or warm, or safe, but it's yours. And as long as you can keep the fire going, as long as your children wake up breathing, as long as your hands still move, it will stay standing. In Victorian England, poverty was not just a condition, it was a moral failure. Or so the system told them. For the peasant class, the cold wasn't just a season, it was a judgment, a test, a punishment, a measuring rod for worthiness. The world was structured to reward discipline and obedience with the barest scraps of survival, while branding misfortune as sin. It was a cruel arithmetic. Suffering was considered divine, and to be poor and miserable was somehow proof that you deserved it. The belief systems of the time were mercilessly efficient at keeping people in their place. The Victorian era, beneath all its lace and gaslight and progress, was constructed on the bones of hierarchy. Everything had its rank. God first, then queen, then landowners, then merchants, then the respectable, poor, and finally, those they called the undeserving. That last category included nearly everyone who couldn't work, wouldn't work, or was simply too sick or too unlucky to survive the rules. A peasant's life was lived under the ever-watchful eye of moral judgment by the church, the parish, the neighbours, and, perhaps most cruelly, by themselves. Religion wasn't merely faith, it was governance. The Anglican Church dictated social behaviour from the pulpit and reinforced it through charity, or the withdrawal of it. Vicars gave sermons on obedience and chastity, while handing out penny loaves with a side of humiliation. If you wanted help, you had to confess, you had to repent, you had to prove you were worthy of being saved. Respectability was the currency of survival. A woman might starve before admitting to prostitution, even if it paid for her child's shoes. A man might die of pneumonia before applying for the workhouse, because to do so meant admitting he could not protect or provide. Children were trained in shame before they could spell their own names. The streets of the poorer districts were policed not only by bobbies, but by glares, whispers, and parish reports. If you accepted charity too often, they kept track. If your laundry hung out too late, they talked. If your child was seen without shoes, someone might knock and ask why. The pressure was constant, exhausting. It broke many. It hardened the rest. Gender roles only magnified the weight of suffering. A man's failure to earn was considered spiritual decay. A woman's poverty was often sexualized, pathologized, or dismissed entirely. Widows were pitied. Spinsters were mocked. Wives were expected to serve, nurse, endure, and remain grateful, even as they bled, starved, or watched their babies die. There was a stark dichotomy between the public face and private torment. Women wore bonnets and tied them tight, even if lice crawled underneath. Men straightened their collars, even if their hands were black with soot. You held your child's hand tight and smiled at the grocer, even if your other hand was clutching your last coin. But morality wasn't only imposed from above, it was internalized. The poor themselves often believed they deserved their lot. After all, hadn't the vicar said so? Hadn't the newspapers called them lazy, immoral, backward. Hadn't the workhouse matron sneered at their complaints? Even when they knew better, when they saw the hypocrisy of the upper classes, they still couldn't shake the feeling that maybe they'd failed, that maybe they were cursed. And when morality failed to hold people in place, shame finished the job. Shame was baked into every inch of peasant life. You felt it when you asked for credit, when your child was barefoot in church, when the landlord inspected your room and found the floor unwashed. You felt it when your husband didn't come home with wages, when the constable knew you by name, when your cough turned bloody and you couldn't afford the apothecary. Shame was your daily bread. But it gets worse. Because Victorian society weaponized that shame, it turned poverty into a theatre, a performance. There were whole bureaucracies whose sole purpose was to distinguish between the deserving and undeserving poor. It was not enough to suffer. You had to suffer correctly, quietly, gratefully. If you cried too loudly, you were dramatic. If you begged too often, you were manipulative. If you stole even once, you were irredeemable. The most visible expression of this cruel morality was the workhouse. It was the state's solution to the inconvenient truth of mass poverty. To receive aid, you had to surrender your dignity, your autonomy, your family. You were shaved, uniformed, numbered. Husbands and wives were separated, children taken away. Inside, you lived on thin gruel and thinner hope, punished not for crimes, but for being a burden. Many chose to starve outside rather than go in. The laws reinforced these beliefs. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 made assistance conditional on entering these institutions, effectively criminalizing the very state of being poor. The middle and upper classes could assuage their conscience. They paid their taxes, supported their church, tossed a coin to a beggar and believed they'd done their part. The poor, meanwhile, were expected to be invisible, compliant, and eternally penitent. And yet, despite this system of shame and moral straitjackets, many peasants developed quiet forms of resistance. They formed mutual aid societies, shared food, lied on each other's behalf, prayed together, hid the sick from authorities, protected the desperate from workhouse inspectors. There was strength even in ruin, pride even in poverty, small rebellions lit like candles in the dark. Because beneath the weight of moral rot, people still loved, still hoped, still believed that the frost would thaw and the sun might return. They had no choice. The system never asked whether they were strong, it simply demanded they endure. And so they did. To be a poor woman in Victorian England was to carry the burden of two worlds, the private realm of suffering and the public stage of performance. She was the spine of the household, the keeper of warmth, the mender of bones, the voice of prayer. But to society, she was at best invisible, at worst a threat. Victorian womanhood had rules, but those rules weren't written for women who lived in tenements. They were written for ladies with parasols and parlours women who had the luxury of modesty, the time to faint delicately, and the money to recover. For the working poor, femininity was a paradox. You were expected to remain pure, chaste, clean, domestic and, somehow also scrub chamber pots, haul coal, birth children in filth, and withstand beatings with dignity. If a poor woman was unmarried and pregnant, she was fallen. If she was married and barren, she was useless. If she worked too much, she was unfeminine. If she worked too little, she was lazy. If she aged poorly, it was her fault for not preserving herself. If she was young and pretty, she was watched by landlords, foremen, inspectors, and if she was raped, she was interrogated more than the man who hurt her. Mothers were judged by the condition of their children. Dirty nails, lice, unpatched shoe sole, signs of moral collapse. A starving child on the street might get a scrap of bread, but his mother would get scorn. She was the one who let it happen, even if there was no food, even if she hadn't eaten in days, even if her husband drank what little they had. Respectable women, those just a rung above, poverty guarded their distance viciously. They might donate a shawl or offer a few pennies, but their charity came with a sermon, a lecture, a reminder that cleanliness was next to godliness, and poverty was a result of bad habits. What they failed to understand or chose not to was that hygiene requires water and soap and time, and that a woman who works 15 hours a day doesn't have time for sermons. The reality was simple. If you were a poor woman, you did what you had to do. Some took in laundry, bled their knuckles scrubbing other people's dirt, standing ankle deep in cold water. Some mended clothes until their eyes gave out. Some sold flowers, matches, ribbons, anything to put food on the table. Some took lovers, called them roommates, and prayed the neighbours stayed silent. Others sold themselves outright. Behind factories, in back alleys, in beds where they prayed to God not to wake up with child. And yet, even among the desperate, the morality of survival was constantly under negotiation. Stealing was wrong, but stealing bread for your child was forgivable. Begging was shameful, but better than selling your body. Turning in a neighbour might earn you a parish voucher, but at the cost of your soul. Every act of survival had a price, not in coin, but in dignity. Men had their own theatre of shame. The Victorian ideal of masculinity demanded strength, stoicism, provision. But for the working class man, those demands were often impossible. How could you be a provider when the mills closed without notice, when the docks froze over, when injury left you coughing blood into a rag while your children watched? Unemployed men were treated with suspicion. A man who didn't work must be a drunk, or a layabout, or worse, dangerous. The pressure to appear useful turned men brittle. Many turned to drink, not because they were weak, but because the weight of failure crushed them, and gin was the only thing that made it quiet. Of course, once they drank, society had its proof. Look at them, the papers wrote. Drunken brutes. Never mind the why. Boys were thrown into labour before their voices cracked. Chimney sweeps, factory hands, coal haulers, 10 years old, shoulders bent under sacks heavier than they were. Childhood was a luxury. Tears were punished. Hunger was normal. Many died before manhood, crushed by machines or eaten alive by disease. But if they made it, they carried the trauma like a second skin. Girls, meanwhile, were trained from the moment they could walk. Cook, sew, wash, smile. Keep your legs closed. Lower your eyes. Don't talk back. Don't laugh too loud. Don't attract attention. If you're lucky, a husband will take you before the factory does. If you're unlucky, you'll end up in the same workshop as your mother, spitting into a handkerchief between stitches. And yet, somehow, families held together. Women who'd lost 3 children still managed to braid the 4th's hair. Men with broken backs taught their sons to tie knots. Grandmothers who had buried husbands and brothers and cousins still sang lullabies by firelight. They had no choice. Survival wasn't about purity, it was about proximity to collapse. Morality bent to need. A mother might tell her daughter never to lift her skirts for coin and still wrap her in a warm coat before she went to the brothel. A father might beat his son for stealing and then pawn his own boots to pay the fine. There were rules, and there were moments when rules didn't matter. Even inside the brutal machinery of Victorian judgment, people found moments of humanity, a neighbour sharing a crust, a stranger leaving a lump of coal at the door, a child wiping their sibling's nose with a bit of old lace. These were acts of grace, quiet, unrecorded, unpaid, but real. The state didn't see these things. The church ignored them. The reformers didn't care. To them, morality was measurably visible in waistlines and workhouse attendance. But the poor had their own ethics, their own codes. Don't snitch. Don't take more than you need. Share if you can. Lie if you must. Protect the children. Bury the dead with dignity. And never, ever let them see you beg for respect. Because respect was a luxury. And for the peasant class, survival had no room for luxury. Only grit. Only endurance. Only the quiet, daily miracle of getting through one more bitter night without breaking. The Victorian age is remembered as an era of progress, innovation, industry, empire. And in many ways, it was. Railways stitched the country together. Telegraph lines shrank the world. Steam engines roared to life in cities that glowed with ambition. There were exhibitions of modern marvels, machines that whispered of a future shaped by iron and intellect. The middle class swelled, the aristocracy held court, and Britain ruled nearly a quarter of the globe. But beneath all that gleam, beneath the iron, beneath the steam, beneath the Queen's portrait on every drawing-room wall, was a labouring class so brutally essential and yet so strategically ignored that the entire system could not exist without their sacrifice. Victorian civilization was built on backs that broke young. The poor were not simply victims of circumstance. They were necessary components in an economic machine that ran on scarcity, dependence, and desperation. Industry did not liberate the working class, it consumed them. Factories were temples of mechanized suffering. Textile mills, matchstick plants, iron foundries, chemical works each had their own version of cruelty, but all operated under the same logic: maximum output, minimum wage, and absolutely no margin for human error. A 10-minute delay could cost a job. A damaged finger could mean permanent dismissal. A child's slow reflexes near a gear wheel, a severed arm, or worse. Children were ideal workers, small, fast, cheap. They cleaned under machines adults couldn't reach, crawled into chimneys to sweep soot with bare hands, worked in match factories where phosphorus chewed through their jaws. The phrase "phossy jaw" became common parlance, a gaping necrotic wound on the face of a child who'd smiled too recently to remember it wasn't supposed to be normal. Women worked too, by the thousands. Their pay was half of what men earned, sometimes less. But their labour was no less grueling. In textiles, they stood for 16 hours at a time, breathing in fine threads that embedded into their lungs and birthed coughing fits that never fully stopped. In the potteries, they handled lead glazes without protection, slowly poisoning themselves. In the laundries, they scalded their hands in boiling water and bleach until they could barely grip a cloth. Yet their work was called unskilled. Even in domestic service, the so-called respectable position women worked to exhaustion, rising before dawn, scrubbing chamber pots, hauling water up 4 flights of stairs, enduring gropes from the master and scorn from the mistress. They were often fired without notice, accused of theft, or worse, pregnancy. And when they were discarded, they had no reference, no protection, and nowhere to go. All of this labour fed the economy. The factory owners flourished. The investors multiplied their returns. The empire swelled with wealth, gold, spices, tea, cotton, sugar, coal, rubber brought from colonies, sustained by even more brutal forms of exploitation. And the poor of England? They kept the machines moving. And they were replaceable. That was the point. Labour was not just undervalued, it was dehumanized. Workers were units, statistics, their injuries recorded only in death tolls, their lives measured in weekly wages and the cost of their coffins. When they protested, they were painted as anarchists. When they unionized, they were criminalized. And when they fell silent, finally beaten by fatigue or fever, they were buried without fanfare and replaced by the next hungry soul. Still, they persisted. They found work however they could, hauling bricks, breaking stone, sweeping streets, unloading coal barges, sweeping ash from rich people's hearths. A widow might make money braiding artificial flowers by candlelight for 13 hours a day. A crippled boy might sell newspapers until his feet gave out. A former soldier might pull a cart through the fog, offering knife-sharpening services to housewives who wouldn't meet his eye. The irony of the Victorian economy was this: it constantly needed the poor and punished them for existing. Parish assistance was stingy, conditional, and humiliating. If you were able-bodied, you were expected to work regardless of whether work existed. If you were injured, you had to prove it again and again. If you were old, you were expected to die quietly, and if you were female, you were always suspect. Your morality and eligibility were judged alongside your hunger. Debt was another trap. Furniture bought on installments, bread on credit, coal borrowed from a neighbour. Everything was owed, everything could be taken away. Pawn shops lined the streets like tombstones offering short-term relief and long-term ruin. You could pawn your coat, your child's shoes, your wedding ring. Then watch. Day by day, as the ticket expired and your past was sold to someone less desperate. Even the housing system was a weapon. Most poor families didn't rent from individual landlords, they rented through intermediaries, rack renters, agents, slumlords. These men owned hundreds of properties, subdivided into single rooms, sometimes without plumbing, often without windows. You might share a floor with strangers, a wall with drunks, a ceiling with rats. Sanitation was non-existent. Waste flowed into open gutters. Sewage clogged the alleys. When cholera came, it spread like wildfire, and when it passed, nothing changed. Because what could the poor threaten to withhold? Their money? Their vote? They had no leverage. The true machinery of Victorian society wasn't just in the factories, it was in the acceptance of all this. Newspapers printed morality tales, warning of lazy paupers. Novels celebrated charity as a virtue for the rich rather than a right for the poor. Philanthropists held dinner parties to raise funds for soup kitchens while servants went home hungry. And all the while, the government counted heads in census books and marked progress by how many miles of railway were laid, how many pounds of cotton were exported, how many tons of coal were dug from the earth. It wasn't that people didn't know. They did. But the suffering of the poor was woven so tightly into the fabric of the economy that to pull one thread threatened to unravel the whole design. And so the poor remained where they were placed by birth, by law, by force, holding up the weight of a nation that declared itself the height of civilization. They were the unseen scaffolding beneath the empire, and when they collapsed, the structure held, because no one looked down long enough to see the cracks. If you were poor in Victorian England and unlucky enough to run out of time, strength, or favours, there was one door left to knock on: the workhouse. Its name was enough to make mouths go dry and stomachs tighten. You didn't speak of it unless you had to. You didn't threaten it unless you meant it. And when you entered, you knew you weren't just poor now. You were officially unwanted. The workhouse was not a refuge. It was not a shelter. It was a machine of moral correction, engineered not to save the destitute, but to frighten them into submission. A system built with surgical cruelty, designed by lawmakers who believed that suffering should be a teacher and that the poor needed more discipline, not more help. To enter the workhouse, you gave up everything. Your clothes, your belongings, your family. Married couples were split into separate wings, forbidden to see one another. Children were taken from parents, housed in dormitories under the eye of matrons and discipline masters. Your name was replaced by a number, your identity reduced to a line in a parish ledger. Inside, you were shaved, scrubbed with lye, deloused, and clothed in a uniform, not out of compassion, but to strip you of self. Cleanliness was not kindness, it was control. Every aspect of life was regulated. When you woke, when you ate, when you prayed, when you defecated. Silence was enforced. Gratitude was expected. Dignity was the first thing confiscated and rarely returned. The food was punishment disguised as nourishment. Gruel, bread, watery broth, endless tea with no sugar. Meals were weighed, timed, and watched. If you complained, you were disciplined. If you refused to eat, you were labelled rebellious, a danger to the moral order. Work was hard, by design. Oakum pulling fibres from old ship ropes until your fingers bled, stone breaking. Laundry without gloves. Tasks chosen not for their economic value, but for their grinding, mind-numbing futility. If you broke, they replaced you. If you spoke out, they punished you. Solitary confinement. Bread and water diets. Public shaming. The goal was not recoverite, was erasure. Workhouses were built in nearly every town by the mid-19th century, funded by local taxes and administered by boards of guardians who sat in comfort, sipping tea while deciding who deserved to suffer more. They called it relief. But the term was as dishonest as the smile on a debt collector's face. The true purpose of the workhouse was deterrence. It was the final stop on the line of failed morality. If you ended up there, it was assumed you had done something wrong. You had sinned, squandered, drank, slept around, slacked off. They ignored that many were elderly, disabled, sick, or abandoned, that the labour market collapsed, that factories closed. That injury, not idleness, brought them here. Nor if you were here, it was your fault. That was the great lie. And society believed it. There were people born in workhouses, raised in their dormitories, who never saw a real home, who never touched a book, who never spoke their own last name aloud because they didn't know what it was. There were women who gave birth in silence, babies whisked away before they could count toes. There were elderly men who died with their boots on, shivering on a cot too narrow for their frame, their life summarized in a 4-line parish note and a pine box grave. And yet, somehow, even beneath all the structure, beneath all the concrete enforcement of despair, there was life. Whispers after lights out, shared scraps, eyes that met across meal tables with a glint of mischief. A hymn hummed when no one else was listening, a child's giggle muffled in the sleeve of a uniform. Small acts of defiance, ghosts of humanity refusing to be exorcised. By the turn of the 20th century, criticism of the workhouse system had grown. Reformers began documenting abuses. Journalists wrote exposés. Charles Dickens had already pulled back the curtain with Oliver Twist. The public, slowly, began to understand that poverty was not a failure of character, it was a result of policy, of industrial expansion with no safety net, of empire built at home on bodies just as surely as it was abroad. And the workhouses, once seen as noble institutions of order, began to rot under scrutiny. Some were shut down, others rebranded, but the damage had been done. By 1930, the system was officially dismantled. The buildings were converted into hospitals, poor schools, shelters, but their foundations remained. You can still find their bones today: grey stone walls, barred windows, wide courtyards designed to funnel people, not comfort them. And the ideology? That poverty equals failure. That's still here. You hear it in headlines that call the poor lazy, in policies that divide the working poor from the unemployed like one is more human than the other, in schools that fund children based on zip code, in healthcare systems that judge the uninsured, in food stamps argued over by people who've never skipped a meal, in the quiet shame that clings to anyone forced to ask for help. The legacy of the Victorian poor isn't just in records or census data, it's in our architecture, our politics, our language, but also, most importantly, it's in our resilience. Because those who endured the coldest nights of the Victorian era didn't just survive, they gave rise to generations who pushed back, who organised, who demanded labour rights, who formed unions, who built the very idea of a social safety net, however threadbare it may still be. They turned pain into pressure, hunger into momentum. And though they were born in fireless rooms, raised in soot, buried in unmarked graves, they lit the first sparks of change. So the next time someone tells you that progress is inevitable, that history always moves forward, remember this: nothing moves unless someone pushes it. And the people who endured the worst of winter, who suffered quietly behind the brick and fog of industrial England, they were the ones pushing hardest. In 1776, Paris was a city of powdered wigs, velvet gloves, perfume, and death. Not the death of peasants crushed under taxes, or soldiers dying in foreign fields that was the usual sort. No, this was death by appointment, death with etiquette, death wrapped in lace and law. This was the era of le duel ritual combat between men who believed that honour was a thing you wore like a coat, visible, essential, and dangerously flammable. A man in 18th century France could kill you for a slight as small as an insult, a muttered word, a sideways glance. Even the accusation of cowardice could spiral into cold steel at dawn. But the duel was not about rage, it was about theatre, about restoring a reputation in a society where image was everything and shame was a fate worse than bleeding out in a hedge behind a cathedral. The dueling culture in France had deep roots. It emerged from medieval traditions of knightly combat and feudal justice, where trial by battle was considered a divine arbitration. But by the 1700s, it had mutated into a strange, courtly ballet of ritualized violence. First, the insult. It could happen anywhere. At court, in a salon, during a card game, over a spilled glass of wine. The moment it was uttered, a chain of events began. Retaliation could not be immediate. That was brutish. Instead, the offended party would send a seconder trusted friend or colliector deliver a written challenge. This document, florid and formal, outlined the offence and demanded satisfaction. The recipient, to maintain his own honour, had little choice but to accept. Declining a duel marked you as a coward. And in this world, cowardice was a kind of social death that could follow you for years, curdling your career and your name. Seconds often, as esteemed as the duelists themselves, negotiated the terms, weapons, location, time, and conditions. Swords or pistols, first blood or to the death, morning or afternoon. How many paces, how many shots, how many witnesses. Dueling was a logistical exercise as much as a violent one. They even had rulebooks. One of the most famous was the Code Duello, which laid out regulations in near legal detail. It dictated how one might provoke, how to apologize acceptably, how to aim, when to aim, and how many physicians should be standing by to stitch up the aftermath. The duel itself was rarely spontaneous. It took planning. You might rise at dawn, dress carefully powdered wig, frock coat, silk cravatand, walk calmly into a garden, field, or quiet forest clearing. Pistols would be loaded by your second, swords polished, gloves removed. Gentlemen did not duel in haste, they duelled with style. And, once the signal was given, silence, 2 men stepping 10 paces apart, turning, firing. One falls, or neither, or both. Sometimes the duel ended after the first shot missed honor satisfied. Sometimes it didn't end until one man lay bleeding into the dirt while the other politely bowed. There were duels where no one died, and duels that ended dynasties. There were men who duelled so often they gained reputations like prize fighters. And there were those who died in their first and only encounter, for reasons so petty even the obituary had to squint. One of the most famous duelists in France was the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, man born to a white plantation owner and a Senegalese slave. Despite his illegitimacy and African ancestry, Saint-Georges became one of the most accomplished fencers, violinists, and composers in Europe. He was known to defeat noblemen twice his rank on the field of honor, often while composing string quartets between engagements. His duels were legendary, his skill unquestioned. His existence, in a society obsessed with bloodlines and whiteness, was itself a kind of social dueler blade in motion. But not all duels were so noble. Some were drunken, impulsive. 2 men, half mad with wine and resentment, agreeing to pistols in an alley. Some were manipulative, used by powerful men to eliminate rivals under the veneer of tradition. Others were romantic, sparked by love triangles, betrayal, or whispers at the opera. Women were sometimes the cause, rarely the participants, but on very rare occasions they duelled two-masked, sword in hand, avenging a name or reclaiming one. And while society pretended to disapprove, while the monarchy and church issued edicts condemning the practice, everyone knew the truth. Dueling was status. It was proof that you mattered enough to kill or be killed, that your name was worth bleeding for. Louis XIV had tried to ban it. So had Louis XV. Both failed. One edict after another was written, posted, ignored. Officers were forbidden from dueling, under pain of death, but did so anyway. The law said, no more honor killings. The culture replied, then there is no honor. During the reign of Louis XVI, dueling reached a kind of fever pitch. Estimates suggest that between 1,715 and 1,770, thousands of men died in duels across France. Not in battle, not in war, but over reputation, pride, and social performance. You could rise through military ranks for gallantry on the battlefield, but lose everything because of a rumor in a salon. The absurdity of it all reached its peak in 1808, when 2 Frenchmen, both balloonists, challenged each other to a duel in mid-air. They rose above Paris in separate hot air balloons, pistols in hand, and fired across the sky like aristocratic birds of prey. One balloon was hit. The loser plummeted to his death in front of a stunned crowd. The other floated calmly back to earth, victorious and unscathed. No court would convict him. After all, he had observed the code. What's striking about the French duel was not the violence, it was the meticulous civility of the violence, the careful choreography, the need to follow form. This was not brawling, it was a language, a conversation with bullets and blades, a negotiation of identity in a society where who you were was defined by who would bleed for you or because of you. But the revolution changed things. The guillotine made honor look quaint. The new republic wanted reason, not ritual, equality, not entitlement. The aristocrats who once duelled to preserve status were now lined up for execution by peasants who didn't care whether their insults had been retracted in writing. By the early 19th century, duelling lost its shine. Not overnight, not completely, but gradually, fatally, it became unfashionable. Napoleon frowned on it. The public began to see it for what it was. Self-indulgent violence, disguised as virtue. Courts stopped looking the other way, and the men who once stood proudly at dawn now looked like relics of a crumbling world. Still, dueling never fully died. Not in France, not in Europe. It just evolved, became metaphor, became lawsuit, became political scandal. The blade was traded for the pen, the pistol for the editorial. And yet, something about it lingers. The idea that reputation is sacred, that words can be weapons, that being insulted demands reply. We see it now in boardrooms, in Twitter wars, in political theatre. The duel never really left it, just changed clothes. But for a brief, bloody century, in the gardens and salons of France, men in powdered wigs and velvet waistcoats danced their last waltz with mortality 10 paces apart, pistol drawn, glove dropped, and nothing between them but the sound of honor breaking like glass. One of the most famous duels in French history did not involve kings or generals but playwrights. In 1830, Alexandre Dumassier, that Dumas, author of The Three Musketeers, found himself deeply insulted by another writer, Jean-Gabriel Capot de Fouillide. The details of the insult are lost to time, but Dumas was not one to let an offence drift quietly into history. Letters were exchanged, tempers rose, seconds were appointed. The meeting was arranged. The duel was fought with pistols in a garden at dawn. Both men fired, both missed. They reloaded, fired again, still missed. On the third exchange, Dumas's bullet tore through Fouillide's hat. At this, the second's agreed honour had been satisfied. No blood. But the hat was ruined, and reputations were intact. It was, by all accounts, a very literary, duel-stylish, dramatic, and ultimately bloodless. Dumas went on to romanticize swordplay and chivalry in his novels, but in real life he knew better than to shoot to kill. Others weren't so lucky. Take the case of the Comte de Saint-Hermine, a nobleman of little patience and considerable arrogance. In 1712, he was offended by the tone of another officer at court, a tone-nothing more, but in that world, tone was everything. The duel was arranged for just outside Versailles. Both men used swords. Saint-Hermine lunged, swift and brutal, and drove his blade through the other man's lungs. The opponent died, gasping, clutching at lace and blood. Saint-Hermine was charged dueling was technically illegal, but was later pardoned by Louis XIV, who admired the Comte's courage. The king even awarded him a new command. Killing someone in a duel was not only excused, it could be career advancement, so long as you did it fashionably. Of course, dueling wasn't always about revenge or pride. Sometimes it was about love. In 1778, two aristocrats, François de la Roche and Henry d'Egremont, fought a duel over the affections of the same woman, the famed courtesan Madame de Saint-Vallier. She had been seen speaking to both men at the opera, nothing more, but their egos would not allow ambiguity. They met in the Bois de Boulogne, a wooded park where such matters were often settled. Swords drawn, wigs tied, cravats tightened. The duel was fast and vicious. Roche slashed d'Egremont across the cheek, a humiliating wound in the world of powdered vanity. Blood spilled onto silk. The seconds rushed in. The fight was stopped. Madame de Saint-Vallier, when informed, reportedly said, "How inconvenient. Now they'll both look dreadful at the ball." She left with a banker the following week. Some duels bordered on the absurd. There was, for instance, the infamous duel of the moustache. In 1861, two minor noblemen, both veterans of Napoleon's army, argued over whose facial hair was superior. What began as friendly ribbing over absinthe turned into heated words, then insults, then the inevitable challenge. They met in a snowy field with sabres. The fight lasted less than 2 minutes. One man's moustache was indeed sliced clean off. The wound superficial, but the embarrassment mortal. He reportedly wore a veil in public for months, refusing to be seen until the hair grew back. Duels didn't always end with wounds to the body. Sometimes they left deeper scars. In 1808, Colonel Fournier and Captain Dupont began a duel that would span 19 years. Their first engagement ended with a scratch, but Fournier, furious, declared the matter unresolved. So they kept dueling, over and over. Swords, pistols, more swords. 14 recorded meetings. Each time, they swore the next would be the last. Eventually, they called a truce tired, older, with enough injuries between them to fill a surgeon's journal. Their tale became legend. It was fictionalized, dramatized, and eventually turned into a novella called The Duel by Joseph Conrad. Even Hollywood took a turn. Ridley Scott adapted it into The Duelists in 1977. Then there were the mass duels. Yes, mass. One particularly unhinged episode occurred in 1547, not in France proper, but under French culture's vast influence, when a noble dispute escalated into an arranged battle between two teams of noblemen. 3 on each side, a formal public affair. The men fought with rapiers before a cheering crowd. 2 were killed, 1 was disemboweled. The survivors bowed afterward, dripping in blood, and were congratulated by the audience. The duel wasn't just a private act, it could be spectacle. And while most duels were between men, history does record a few remarkable exceptions. In 1792, 2 women of noble birth, Madame de Polignac and Mademoiselle de Lestrefort, a duel with pistols after a scandalous exchange of letters. The reason, a social slight. One had failed to stand during the other's entrance at a salon. Dueling was considered improper for women, but these weren't ordinary women. They met in secret, chose pistols. Both missed on the first shot. On the second, Madame de Polignac grazed Leicester's shoulder. a surgeon stitched the wound. The duel was declared completed, and the next week both women were seen attending the same dinner, nodding coolly from opposite ends of the table. Another tale, possibly apocryphal, but persistent, tells of two noble women who duelled topless. The logic, bizarre as it sounds, was to prevent infection from bits of cloth lodging in wounds. Historians debate the veracity of this account, but it speaks to the way duels blurred the line between martial act and mythic theatre. And then there was Napoleon. He loathed duelling. As a military man, he saw it as wasteful. Officers maiming or killing one another over matters of pride weakened the army. He issued edicts banning the practice among his ranks, threatened harsh punishment. But even he couldn't stop it entirely. Officers still found ways: clandestine meetings, dueling, vacations, informal matches in forest glades, disguised as fencing practice. Pride doesn't vanish under regulation. It just learns to wear a disguise. Even into the 19th century, the duel held sway in France's cultural imagination. Newspapers covered notable duels like sport. Caricaturists mocked them. Poets romanticized them. And in every provincial town, there were stories half true, half dreamed-of uncles, grandfathers, patrons, lovers, who had once taken the field for honor. But as guns became deadlier and laws stricter, the tide turned. By the late 1800s, dueling was increasingly prosecuted. Court cases were no longer lenient. The Code Civil replaced the Code Duello. France was modernizing, and modernity had no room for the kind of pride that left bodies bleeding on manicured lawns. Still, the stories remain. Of poets with pistols, of counts with swords, of moustaches lost, reputations saved, and egos shattered. Duels were never about logic. They were about status, image, power. The theatre of masculinity in a world that worshipped appearance above all else. And in that brief flash of steel-ton paces apart, gloves on the ground, breath held, the entire lie of civilization revealed itself. That beneath the wigs, behind the velvet, through the fog of perfume and etiquette, men still bled like anyone else. What makes a man point a pistol at another over a rumour? What convinces him that a scratch to his reputation is worth the risk of a bullet through the lung, that a whispered insult outweighs a life? The answer, in 18th century France, was not madness but honour. Honour in this era wasn't just a concept, it was a currency, a substance, a material presence, as real as velvet or gold. You could earn it, display it, lose it, defend it. It lived not inside you, but around you, like a scent, like an aura. And if someone tarnished it, they hadn't just hurt your feelings, they had robbed you in front of witnesses. The duel was the court where these crimes were judged. A violent symbolic stage on which men announced, "I am not to be mocked." The pistol or the sword became a signature in blood, authorizing the version of yourself you wished to preserve. And it worked because everyone believed in the game. In salons, at court, even in the taverns, your reputation was your greatest possession. If it faltered, so did your career, your marriage prospects, your inheritance. Gossip had more power than law. A smirk in the wrong room could do more damage than a lawsuit. And once suspicion stuck to you, it was nearly impossible to scrub off. That's why duels mattered, because they were understood not as violence, but as justice, poetic justice, social justice, reputational survival. They allowed men, especially aristocrats and military officers, to control the narrative. To say, "I was wronged and I answered," even if they lost, even if they died, A man who fought and fell was respected. A man who refused was erased. Of course, this framework wasn't about universal dignity. It was gendered, classed, and exclusive. Poor men didn't duel, they brawled, and society treated them accordingly. A noble could kill another noble and be seen as honourable. A cobbler stabbing a tailor over the same offence would be charged with murder. Women, meanwhile, had no real access to the economy of honour. Their virtue was defined entirely by reputation, but they had no official way to defend it. They could not challenge slander with a blade. They had to rely on male relatives to handle it, or else live with the shame. When women did fight back through words, poison, or even the rare pistol, they were painted as unstable or unnatural. Yet they suffered under the same social weights. The irony is staggering. In a system that exalted honour above all, most people had no say in it. Only the privileged got to fight for theirs. But there's another layer. The duel wasn't just about defence, it was about performance. It was a ritual, a theatre, a spectacle designed to display courage, control, style, the fencing stance, the glove slap, the precise number of paces, the way you bowed, before and after. All of it mattered. All of it was part of the performance of being a man in a time when masculinity was fragile, volatile, and always on display. And that display had audiences. In Paris, it wasn't uncommon for duelists to bring spectators. Duels were whispered about in cafes, recounted in salons, written up in newspapers. The best duelists had reputations like actors or boxers. Some had groupies, others inspired art. A particularly stylish death could become legend overnight. It was violence wrapped in aesthetics. And that, perhaps, was the most seductive part of it all. The beauty of danger, the clean, symmetrical elegance of two men, mirrored, facing off in perfect stillness until motion shattered the scene. It was controlled death, sanitized, measured, not the chaos of war or the gore of the guillotine. This was murder in a tailored suit, bleeding politely into a linen cravat. And yet it was still murder. Make no mistake, duels killed people, brilliant people, idiots, artists, officers, fathers, brothers, all for words, for pride, for social oxygen. And the cost was immense. Letters from widows to dueling survivors still exist, begging for explanations. Court records show children left behind, families ruined. Some duelists took their own lives after surviving guilt-ridden, disillusioned, devastated. Not everyone walked away with a ribbon and applause. For many, the duel didn't restore honour. It simply exposed how empty the concept had become. The Enlightenment, that age of reason, brought new eyes to old rituals. Philosophers began to mock the duel. Journalists called it barbaric. Satirists skewered its vanity. Rousseau called honour the most dangerous of all public lies. Voltaire laughed at its contradictions. And yet, even as thinkers turned against it, society clung on, because reason rarely defeats ritual, not all at once, and because the duel, like all social customs, served a deeper purpose than it admitted. It let men express vulnerability through violence. It let them say, "You hurt me," without weeping. It gave them a language for fear and humiliation, and betray alone they were allowed to speak. That's why it took so long to die. The duel's slow fade from French life didn't come from a single law or revolution. It came from accumulated absurdity. Too many pointless deaths, too many absurd disputes, too many men bleeding out under orange trees because someone said their jacket looked cheap. Eventually, the jewel became what it always secretly was: theatre, costume without cause, pantomime without danger. By the early 1900s, the last serious duels in France took place between journalists and politicians. Some drew blood, most didn't. The pistols were real, but the stakes had changed. No one wanted to die over editorials anymore. And when the world descended into world wars, the duel seemed almost laughably quaint. Who would shoot one man at dawn when millions were dying in trenches? And yet, the myth lingers. You still hear it in phrases like, "defend your honor," in the image of men with guns settling their affairs face to face, in the cinematic fantasy of the lone avenger, coat flapping, ready to die for a principle. We still love the idea of controlled revenge, of elegant justice, of ritualized violence. Because somewhere, deep in the cultural psyche, the duel speaks to a truth we still struggle to articulate. That reputation matters. That pain needs expression. And that sometimes performance is survival. But history has shown us where that road ends. In a forest clearing, 2 men, 10 paces apart, and one of them doesn't walk away. In the bone-dry southern desert of Peru, long before the Incas, long before Columbus, long before history even had a name, a people carved stories into the earth so large they could only be read by the godsaw, the sky. They are the Nazca lines, and they are unlike anything else on this planet. From ground level, they're nearly invisible. You might stand in the middle of one and think it's just a faint trencher, shallow, meaningless groove, scratched into rust-colored soil. But rise into the air just 500 feet and the earth tells a different story. Suddenly you see hummingbirds with wingspans longer than buses, monkeys with spiraled tails that curl into eternity. A spider so precise its legs match the golden ratio. A man with giant round eyes, waving to the heavenser, warning them. And they're not drawn. They're scraped. The Nazca lines are geoglyphs images, made not by adding material, but by removing it. The Nazca people carefully brushed away the top layer of reddish, iron-rich rock, revealing the pale earth beneath. The lines they etched, some thin as a string, others wide as road shave, survived not because they were hidden, but because the desert has no wind, no rain, no mercy, just stillness, just sun. The oldest of these lines are believed to date from between 500 BCE and 500 CE. That's over 2,000 years ago. No metal tools, no wheels, no aerial views. Just patience, geometry, and what appears to be an unshakable desire to be seen from above. But why? That's the question that has haunted archaeologists, historians, mystics, conspiracy theorists, and travellers for generations. Why did the Nazca create these enormous, precise images in a landscape they themselves couldn't fully see? Why devote hundreds, possibly thousands of labour hours to a drawing that only the birds, and perhaps the gods, could admire? There are theories. Some say the lines were part of an astronomical calendar aligned with the sun, the solstices, certain constellations. It's true that some lines do point to solar events, but others don't. Others claim they were irrigation maps, ways to mark underground aquifers in a place where water was life and scarcity defined existence. Again, some alignments match that idea, but why the monkey? Why the spider? Why the astronaut-looking figure waving from the hillside? Then there are the more spiritual explanations, that the lines were offerings, messages, ritual pathways meant to be walked, not seen, sacred journeys etched into the earth for the gods to observe. In this theory, the images weren't meant for human eyes at all. They were prayers not written in ink, but in motion, a kind of kinetic scripture. Indeed, many of the lines form long, straight paths, stretching more than 9 miles without deviation. These paths may have been walked during ceremonies, possibly in silence, possibly barefoot, participants dragging objects behind them, their steps carving meaning into a world of dust and heat. No temples, no pulpits, just desert, just stars. But it gets stranger, because the more you look, the more impossible it seems. The precision, the scale, the geometry, some of the figures, the stylized bird forms, especially maintain near-perfect proportions across hundreds of feet, without drones, without scaffolding, without any obvious vantage point. No hills nearby, no high towers to view from, and yet they nailed it. One possibility? They used grids, a kind of pre-modern pixel system. Start with a small drawing, divide it into squares, then scale each square up proportionally on the ground. It's tedious, but it works. And it shows something remarkable, that the Nazca weren't just religious. They were engineers. But here's the thing, we don't know. We don't know their language. We have no written records, no codices, just pottery, bones, textiles, and the lines themselves. The Nazca didn't tell us what they were doing. They just left us the evidence and vanished into history's long silence. Which, of course, is why the theories get wilder. Aliens, that's the obvious leap for some. That the lines are runways, landing strips, communication beacons for ancient astronauts. This idea exploded in the 1960s when writers like Erich von Däniken popularized the notion that these geoglyphs were too sophisticated for primitive people and thus must have extraterrestrial origin. It's seductive, flashy, and almost certainly wrong, because attributing ancient achievements to aliens usually says more about our assumptions than theirs. The Nazca people weren't primitive. They built aqueducts still in use today. They cultivated crops in one of the harshest climates on Earth. They understood astronomy, art, scale. They didn't need aliens. They needed respect. But the mystery remains. And part of what makes the Nazca lines so haunting is that they were clearly meant to endure, not just for their time, but for all time. Unlike buildings, they can't be looted. Unlike scrolls, they don't rot. They are messages etched directly into the bones of the world. And yet, we don't know what they say. Imagine a civilization 0 years from now, finding only our satellite dishes. No context, no internet, just the black mirror of a screen. That's what the Nazca left as signals, without keys. Still, we can guess. Some archaeologists now believe that the geoglyphs were linked to water rituals. The Nazca relied on underground rivers and seasonal rains that rarely came. The animal shapes birds, fish, monkeys might be spiritual references to fertility, life, movement. Some geoglyphs are near ancient pukios, spiral wells that still draw water today. Perhaps the lines were paths of procession to sacred sites. Perhaps they were prayers for rain. One compelling argument is that the act of making the lines was the ritual, that walking the lines was a way to connect land and sky, that they were maps of belief, not geography, that the shapes were less important than the devotion required to bring them into being. If so, then the Nazca lines are less like messages and more like music. You don't stare at a symphony, you hear it, you move with it, you live inside it. Maybe the Nazca moved through their own art that way, feet carving belief into silence. Today, the Nazca Lines are a UNESCO World Heritage Site. They're protected, studied, monitored, but not fully understood. Tourists fly over them in tiny planes. Pilots bank left and right, pointing to the condor, the tree, the whale. Visitors press their noses to the glass, take pictures, whisper, "Why would they do this?" And the desert says nothing. It just keeps them quiet, massive, unblinking. Messages to the sky, written by hands now dust, still waiting for someone any who can finally read them. Long before they drew hummingbirds in the desert, the Nazca were trying not to die. The Nazca region is a hellscape by most definitions. It lies within the Peruvian coastal desert, between the Andes and the Pacific. It gets less than 4 millimeters of rain per year, so little that some meteorologists classify parts of it as hyperarid. Rain doesn't fall here, not really. Rivers come and go like rumors. The sun doesn't warm its scalds, and yet people lived here. Not only lived, they thrived. For centuries. The Nazca weren't an empire like the Inca. They didn't build fortresses in the mountains or string up massive road systems. But they understood the land like surgeons understand anatomy. They knew its scars, its rhythms, its buried veins, and they learned how to draw life out of it anyway. Their secret was water. They found it where no one else could, beneath them. The Nazca tapped into ancient underground aquifers using one of the most remarkable hydraulic systems in the pre-Columbian world, the puquios. Imagine a desert, bone dry, no rivers in sight. Now picture a spiral carved into the earth wide, stepped, stone-lined. It looks almost decorative, like a desert nautilus. But climb down and you'll find water. Cool, flowing, drinkable, channeled underground through stone canals. These puquios weren't simple wells. They were engineered air shafts designed to create pressure differentials that forced groundwater into usable flow, sometimes across several miles. And they weren't temporary solutions. Many still function today, over 0 years after they were built. Local farmers use them just like the Nazca did, guiding the water through furrows to irrigate crops like maize, beans, and squash. These systems were more than practical. They were spiritual. Water was not just sustenance, it was divinity, sacred. To control it was to earn the favor of the gods. The puquios weren't just utilities. They were acts of faith. Above ground, the Nazca farmed in small, community-extended families clustered around arable plots. They worked with terraces and gravel-covered fields to prevent erosion. In places where the sand could swallow a child whole in one gust, they anchored their crops with rocks and patience. They grew cotton, toused for weaving garments, ritual textiles, and ropes. Llamas and alpacas grazed on whatever could be coaxed from the scrublands. And while meat was rare, the Nazca knew how to preserve fish and game using salt and sun. They traded along river valleys and up into the mountains, exchanging textiles, ceramics, and dried food with other Andean cultures. Their society wasn't flashy, but it was functional. Houses were built from adobe bricks, low and wide, to resist wind and heat. Rooms were small, dark, cool. Storage pits were dug for food and tools. Fires were built in hearths for cooking and offerings. At night, the stars stretched from horizon to horizon, so vivid you could read omens in the sky. And the Nazca did. Their belief system was as intricate as their waterworks. Gods of fertility, of rain, of earth and sky. They believed in a universe of reciprocal relationships. Give to the land, and it gives back. Anger the gods, and you get drought, disease, collapse. Shamans held high status. They read signs in animal entrails, in the motion of birds, in the alignment of stars. They brewed hallucinogens often from the San Pedro Cactusto open vision space during rituals. These rituals weren't private affairs. They were communal, performed on ceremonial mounds, accompanied by music panpipes, drums, voices, by dance, by blood. Animal sacrifice was common. Human sacrifice, rare but not unknown, particularly in times of ecological crisis. This brings us to the most haunting part of the Nazca story, because despite their brilliance, their endurance, and their deep environmental knowledge, they collapsed. By the 6th century CE, the Nazca culture began to fragment. Villages were abandoned. Ceremonial centers fell silent. Pottery styles changed. Trade diminished. What happened? Again, there are theories. One is climate. Around 500–600 CE, sediment cores show signs of dramatic El Niño events, massive flooding, followed by crushing drought. Rain, when it came, arrived in torrents, turning dry riverbeds into death traps. Crops washed away, homes eroded. The careful balance of the desert snapped. Another theory is deforestation. To maintain their fields and build their homes, the Nazca cleared forests, particularly the prosopis tree, a hardy species that held the soil together. As these trees vanished, so did the land's ability to hold itself in place. Topsoil blew away. Rivers widened. Fertility collapsed. It was a slow-motion catastrophe, human-driven. Then there's the theory that the very lines themselves may have been a desperate response. Some scholars believe the most elaborate geoglyphs date to the later Nazca period after things began to unravel. In this telling, the Nazca lines aren't confident declarations of spiritual balance. They're pleas. Grand-scale prayers carved in the hope that the gods might notice. The monkey, the hummingbird, the spider, each one a symbol, a message, an offering. Please, let the water return. But it didn't. The Nazca didn't vanish all at once. Cultures rarely do. Their descendants merged into later Andean societies, Wari, Chincha, and eventually the Inca. Their technologies, rituals, and symbols echoed forward. But their city-states crumbled. Their desert art faded into myth, and for centuries the outside world forgot they existed. Until 1927. That year, a Peruvian archaeologist named Toribio Mejia Xespe stumbled across strange patterns in the desert while walking the foothills. He couldn't see their full shape, but he knew they weren't random. He wrote about them. Others followed. A German mathematician named Maria Reich devoted her life to studying and preserving the lines, crawling across the desert with a measuring tape and broom, mapping what the ancients left behind. Today, satellites map them in minutes. Drones fly overhead. LiDAR peels back centuries of erosion. And yet, for all our tools, we're still chasing ghosts. Because surviving the desert wasn't just about irrigation or ritual. It was about humility and understanding that humans are small, fragile, and only ever guests in the lands they claim to master. The Nazca lived on the edge of possibility, and when they pushed too far, cut too deep, cleared too much, asked too often, the desert answered. With silence. And yet, their lines remain. Impossibly clean, strangely precise, etched into the earth like scarcer scripture. We don't know exactly what they meant, but we know what they cost. And we should listen. Because when a people vanish, they rarely leave behind words. They leave warnings, etched in stone, whispered through dust, written on the ground for anyone still watching from above. The Nazca are silent now. But the world hasn't stopped asking what they meant. Every year, thousands of tourists flock to the high plateaus of southern Peru. They come in buses, caravans, prop planes. They peer out through curved aircraft windows, necks craned, cameras ready, as the ground reveals its secrets bird by bird, spiral by spiral. You can see them gripping their phones, mouths slightly open, trying to make sense of what the earth is whispering. Some leave satisfied, most leave with more questions. That's the power of the Nazca lines. They don't explain, they haunt. Ever since their rediscovery in the 20th century, they've invited interpretation and speculation, and a fair amount of nonsense. In the 1960s and 70s, the mystery of the Nazca lines became a cultural phenomenon. The idea that they were landing strips for aliens popularized by Erich von Däniken in Chariots of the Gods spread like wildfire. The appeal was obvious: giant images, viewable only from the sky, in a civilization without known aerial capability. It had to be extraterrestrial. Of course, the logic was flawed, and often deeply condescending. Because the lines don't require aliens to be impressive, they require us to accept that ancient humans were astonishingly sophisticated and that mystery doesn't always mean magic. Still, the myths endure. UFO hunters point to the astronaut, a large humanoid figure etched into a hillside with round eyes and an arm raised skywarder's proof of contact. They call it a greeter, a signal, a carving of someone or something that visited. Archaeologists say it's likely a stylized shaman or deity, but the debate never dies. Others fixate on the shapes. Why the hummingbird? Why the spider? Why the spiral-tailed monkey with hands so long they touch its own feet? The animals depicted in the geoglyphs aren't native to the coastal desert. They're jungle creatures from the east. Creatures the Nazca likely encountered through trade and pilgrimage. Perhaps they symbolized fertility, or strength, or motion. Maybe they were totem spirit animals carved into the earth to bring balance or favor. Or maybe they were just beautiful. That's one theory, simple, unromantic, and oddly profound. That the lines weren't messages, or maps, or mysticism, that they were art, enormous, devotional art, drawn not to be seen, but to be made. The act of creation itself was the offering. Like Tibetan, sand mandalas swept away by wind, or cathedrals no one finishes building. Imagine that. A society so connected to its land, its sky, its breath, that it etched its myths across miles, knowing they might never be viewed in full. Knowing that the gods, and not the people, were the intended audience. There's poetry in that, and pain. Because while the lines have lasted, much of what the Nazca were has not. We have fragments, pottery with jaguar motifs, textiles dyed with cochineal red, bones arranged in graves with tools and combs and the occasional gourd. But we don't know their language, their names, their stories. No books, no codices, no scrolls. Just scars on the desert. And yet, those scars speak. They remind us that humans are not defined by permanence. We're defined by intention. The Nazca poured their lives into the earth not to last forever, but to matter. and they do. Today, the Nazca lines are protected, sort of. UNESCO listed them as a World Heritage Site in 1994. Peruvian archaeologists, including local descendants of the Nazca, continue to document, measure, and protect them. Drones have discovered dozens of new glyphs simpler, older, but no less haunting. Giant cats, warriors, fish, and yet the threats are constant. In 2014, Greenpeace activists illegally entered the Nazca zone and laid down a banner next to the hummingbird damaging the fragile surface crust. In 2018, a truck driver veered off a nearby road and left deep tire marks through several lines. The desert is tough, but not indestructible. Ironically, the greatest danger to the Nazca lines isn't nature. It's us. Tourism, development, invasive curiosity, and underneath it all, climate change. The same desert stability that preserved the lines for 20 years is now at risk. Increased rainfall in the region part of broader atmospheric shifts could erode the fragile top layer. In trying to understand the past, we might be unmaking it. So what do we do with this mystery? With these shapes? With a story we can't fully read? Maybe we listen. Not with our ears, not even with science, but with humility. Because the Nazca didn't leave us a monument to ego. They left us a question. Can humans live in balance with a land that does not love them back? Can we etch meaning into a world we can't control? Can we build something that matters, even if no one sees it from the sky? That's what the Nazca ask. And whether we answer with reverence or ruin is still up to us. In the cold, wet north of Britannia, beyond the Roman roads and civilized towns, there was a line where maps ended and nightmare began. They called it Caledonia. Today, we call it Scotland. But in the early 1st century CE, to the Roman Empire, it was the edge of the world. And somewhere in that mist-choked wilderness, an entire Roman legion, the 9th, Hispana-vanished. No bodies, no battlefield, no survivors, just silence. The 9th Legion, Legio the 9th Hispana, was one of Rome's most storied units. Founded in the late Republic, it fought under Caesar in Gaul. It survived the civil wars. It served in Hispania, Africa, Germania. Its banners bore the boar. Its men were hardened veterans of empire. By the early 100s CE, the 9th was stationed in Eboracum, modern-day York guarding the frontier against the unruly northern tribes. And then, sometime after 108 CE, it disappears from the historical record. Completely. There are no further inscriptions, no known deployment, no casualty reports, no records in the imperial rolls. It's as if the 9th simply walked into the fog and never returned. So what happened? That question has haunted historians, archaeologists, novelists, and conspiracy theorists for centuries. The official records of Rome, usually so precise, fall inexplicably quiet. One year, the 9th is constructing forts and roads in Britain. A few years later, nothing. Gone. The most popular theory? They were destroyed, wiped out, annihilated by the Caledonian tribes in a catastrophic ambush north of Hadrian's future wall. It's not as far-fetched as it sounds. The region was a nightmare for Roman logistics. Dense forests, rocky terrain, torrential rain, and tribes who fought not in formation, but with brutal guerrilla tactics, screaming from the hills, striking from behind, vanishing into the trees. They had no love for Rome and every incentive to resist. In 117 CE, Hadrian became emperor. One of his first moves? pulling back Roman influence in Britain. Within a few years, construction began on Hadrian's Wall, a physical barrier across the island. Defensive, not aggressive. A change in posture. As if Rome had learned something terrifying from a recent loss. Many believe that loss was the ninth. There's circumstantial evidence. The last known inscription, from the ninth in Britain, dates to around 108 CE. Later records mention new legions being moved in to reinforce the North X2 Fulminata. 6. Victrix. Some say that's just administrative reshuffling. Others say it looks a lot like a replacement. Roman historians of the time are silent on the matter. Suspiciously silent, which in itself is revealing. When a legion was disgraced, destroyed, or dishonored, Rome often responded with erasure. If they died bravely, they were remembered. If they were humiliated, forgotten. As if by deleting their name, they could delete the shame. Tacitus, writing around this time, never mentions the ninth's fate, neither does Cassius Dio. Later, chroniclers from the 4th century make vague references to lost legions, massacres in the north, but none offer clarity. The gaps are maddening. So we look to the ground. Archaeological digs in Scotland have uncovered temporary camps, burnt fortifications, piles of Roman equipment scattered far beyond the old borders, but nothing definitive, no mass graves, no stamped tiles, no legionary insignia that shouts, "This was the ninth, and here they fell." It's all inference. But inference can be powerful. Some historians suggest the ninth was lured into the highlands by false peace talks told a coalition of tribes wanted to surrender. The ninth, eager for glory, marched in, expecting compliance. What they got was a trap. Imagine it. Thousands of legionary armor glinting, standards raised marching into the hills, narrow passes, strange silence, and then screams. Spears from the tree line, fire from behind, a complete collapse. The standards fall, the centurions are cut down, the cohort formations shatter under the weight of a terrain they don't understand, and enemies who understand them all too well. They try to retreat, but the forests close in, and no one comes back. But here's the twist. Some scholars argue the ninth didn't vanish in Britain at all. Later inscriptions found in Nijmegen, in what is now the Netherlands, mention remnants of the ninth possibly as late as the 120s CE. Could it be that the legion was transferred out of Britain after all? Reassigned to a quieter posting? Broken up into smaller units? Maybe. But then, why the total silence in Britain? No farewell inscription, no transfer record, just a stop. Others point to possible deployment in the east, maybe to Armenia or Judea or Parthia regions racked by rebellion and war. It's possible the ninth died not in Scottish bogs, but in desert heat, crushed in a revolt far from the island where they'd spent decades. And yet, the legend sticks, because a vanishing is always more compelling than a footnote. In Britain, the myth of the lost ninth took root. By the Middle Ages, it had grown into a folk-tale Roman soldiers who marched north and were cursed, swallowed by mist, transformed into stones. Some said they were still out there, alive and eternal, haunting the moors. Others claimed they were betrayed by their own, executed for mutiny, buried under cairns that no one dare disturb. The story fascinated writers. Rudyard Kipling immortalized it in Puck of Pook's Hill, imagining the ghost of a Roman officer wandering Britain in search of his lost legion. In the 1950s, Rosemary Sutcliffe wrote The Eagle of the Ninth, a beloved historical novel about a young Roman trying to reclaim his father's honor by retrieving the legion's fallen eagle standard. The myth crossed into film, comics, video games. The ninth became shorthand for loyalty, loss, the high cost of empire. But beneath all the storytelling is a real mystery. Something happened to the ninth, and whatever it was, Rome didn't want to talk about it. That's telling. Rome loved its victories, inscribed them in marble, chanted them in forums. But its failures, they were buried sometimes literally. And so the ninth remains a riddle. Not just a military unit, but a mirror. A symbol of what happens when power overreaches, when empire forgets its limits. When legions march not for protection, but pretty and find that the world beyond the border is not waiting to be conquered, but to push back. Somewhere, north of the wall, perhaps in a bog or forest or unmarked glen, their bones lie still, unfound. And perhaps that's best. Because a mystery is a kind of monument too. One you don't need to find to feel. To understand the mystery of the ninth, you first have to understand what a Roman legion was. Not just a fighting unit, not just 1,000 men with swords. A Roman legion was order, embodied, a living machine made of iron, oath, and fear. It marched like a single creature, devoured land like fire, and left behind roads, forts, and silence. Rome didn't build an empire because it had the best weapons. It built an empire because it had legions. And the legion wasn't just a tool of war. It was a worldview. Let's break it down. At full strength, a standard legion contained about 5,060 soldiers, divided into cohorts and centuries. The basic unit was the century, commanded by a centurion, not a general, but something worse. A professional, fanatically disciplined officer who could turn a group of farmers and criminals into a phalanx of obedience. Centurions weren't glamorous, they were brutal. Their authority came from the vine staff vitis they carried, used freely on the backs of their men. Training was relentless. Weapons practice, forced marches, disciplined drills. Legionaries were expected to run 20 miles in full armor and build a fortified camp by sundown. Every day. No excuses. If you tripped, if you fell behind, you were punished. If you deserted, you were hunted, tortured, executed. If your unit deserted, you faced the worst punishment in military history, decimation. 1 in every 10 men chosen by lot. The unlucky man beaten to death by his comrades, slowly, without weapons. Because in the Roman army, shame was a weapon sharper than the gladius. So why did anyone join? Because legion service was a path to power. For poor citizens, it was a ticket to land, pay, and Roman identity. 25 years of service could earn you a pension and citizenship for your children. For non-citizens provincials, conquered peoplecit was a ladder. Endure the discipline, survive the wars, and Rome might let you in. But more than money or status, being a legionary meant being part of something immortal, a brotherhood, a cult of blood and order. Each legion had its own symbolan animal or deity, and its own eagle standard, a golden idol carried into battle, guarded with fanatical zeal. If the eagle fell, the legion's soul was lost. They called it the Aquila, and it was sacred. The Ninth Legion's symbol was the boar ferocious, unstoppable, a beast that charges into chaos. Their eagle was lost with them, perhaps taken, perhaps hidden, perhaps buried with the last man standing. We'll never know. But to lose an eagle was more than symbolic. It was catastrophic. In 53 BCE, when Crassus's legions were slaughtered by the Parthians at Carrhae and their eagles captured, Rome entered a period of political humiliation so deep it took decades to recover. Augustus eventually negotiated to get those eagles back, not because they held power, but because they held meaning. The legionary wasn't just a soldier. He was a walking piece of Roman authority. His armor segmentata, plates, and helmet was a uniform of ideology. His presence in a foreign land meant Rome is here. Every time he marched, dug a trench, built a road, he pushed the empire forward. The legions didn't just fight, they built the Roman world. And they were feared. Not just by enemies, but by Romans themselves. A legion could crush a rebellioner, become one. In the year of the 4 emperors, 69 CE, legions proclaimed and overthrew Caesars like chess pieces. They were the kingmakers of the empire. When they marched on Rome, the Senate trembled, which is why loyalty was everything. Legions swore a personal oath sacramentum to their emperor. Betrayal was treason, cowardice was pollution, and disappearance, that was unthinkable. Which brings us back to the 9th. Because for a legion to vanish was not just a military loss, it was a cosmic one. The Roman world depended on the illusion of eternal control, that no enemy was too savage, no climate too hostile, no tribe too wild. When the 9th disappeared, that illusion cracked. Imagine the logistics. A lost legion meant 5,000 trained men gone, decades of resources, thousands of weapons, dozens of officers, the eagle, the standard, the name, the legacy. Gone. It sent shockwaves through command structures. Recruitment patterns shifted. Reinforcements were moved. Entire regions were reclassified as high risk. If the 9th could fall, so could any. So how did Rome respond? With silence. The empire had no tolerance for embarrassment, no press conferences, no apologies. When legions failed spectacularly, they were sometimes dissolved, stripped of their number, their standard retired, their memory erased, like a name scratched off a tombstone. But soldiers don't forget. Veterans of the 9th, who may have survived, scattered survivors, lone messengers, wounded escapees, likely lived in quiet disgrace, transferred, reassigned, not celebrated, not trusted. There's a theory that remnants of the 9th became auxiliary units, broken down and absorbed into other formations. If so, they carried the silence with them. But the wound remained, because Rome prided itself on order, on permanence, on the belief that the empire was not just a government, but reality itself. And when reality breaks, when a legion disappears into the fog, you don't explain it. You bury it. And maybe that's the real story of the 9th. Not just their loss, but how the machine tried to erase the evidence of failure, which makes the myth even more powerful. Because the legion refuses to stay forgotten. They live in novels, films, museums. They live in the damp soil of northern Britain, where the wind howls across ruined forts and whispers rumours to anyone who listens. They live in the questions we keep asking. What happened? Where did they go? Why does it still matter? It matters because the legion was Rome, and Rome, in its bones, believed it could not break. The 9th reminds us it could, and did. They were once called Hispana Triumphalist, triumphing Spaniards. They earned their name in fire and conquest, in the blood-washed fields of Iberia. They served under Caesar. They marched across Gaul. They crushed rebellions in Africa, in Germany. They built cities. They paved roads. And in the end, the 9th Legion marched north and vanished. Not in smoke, not in ceremony, but in silence. No grand battle recorded, no glorious last stand, just a blank page where there should have been an ending. And that's why they endure. Because history doesn't just survive in what we know, it lives in what we question. The ninth became a symbol not of military glory, but of the limits of empire, of the places where maps lie, where boots sink into soil that refuses to be tamed, where the machine of Rome, for all its gears and genius, could grind to a halt against something as old and wild as the Highlands. And what makes the story unforgettable isn't that it ends in defeat. It's that it doesn't end at all. It just stops. And the human mind hates that. We crave resolution. We want to know what happened. We want closure, bodies, artifacts, eyewitnesses. We want the facts to comfort us. But sometimes, history leaves only the outline of truth. The ghost of a story, its core missing, its edges blurred, and we have to sit in that space, that uncomfortable absence. That's where myth begins. Not in lies, but in the fertile ground between known and unknowable. The ninth has been reborn dozens of times through myth. In Kipling's mournful poetry, where a ghost searches forever for his brothers. In Sutcliffe's Eagle of the Ninth, where a son goes north to reclaim honour from the ashes. In movies and novels, where the Legion becomes a cipher for the eternal soldier, the loyal warrior undone by politics, hubris, or the cruelty of chance. And in every version, the story is different. Sometimes they're betrayed. Sometimes they fight to the last man. Sometimes they disappear, on purpose tired of empire, choosing freedom. Sometimes they fall into magic, cursed to wander the moors. Sometimes they never existed at all. But the one thing they never are is irrelevant. Because the idea of an empire that can lose 5,000 men and pretend it didn't happen, that idea resonates. We see it today, in how nations treat their failures, in how governments sanitize defeat, in how history books omit the messy endings, and in how we, the readers, the inheritors, are left with the task of reassembling meaning from fragments. The ninth becomes more than a military unit. They are a parable, a question. What does it cost to be forgotten? And what does it mean to keep remembering anyway? Somewhere in northern Britain, maybe in a moss-covered ravine, maybe beneath a sheep pasturely, the rusted remains of helmets, swords, sandals, maybe bones. Maybe the eagle, buried in shame. Maybe nothing. Maybe we'll never find them. And maybe we shouldn't. Because there's a kind of reverence in leaving mystery alone. In letting it stand, not as a gap in our knowledge, but as a memorial to human uncertainty. Because history isn't just kings and battles and treaties, it's disappearance, silence, the shape of what once was, pressed into the earth like a footprint in mud. The longer we stare at it, the more it says. And in that silence, we hear ourselves. We hear the soldier wondering if he will be remembered. We hear the tribe, victorious and unrecorded. We hear the empire flinch just once before reasserting control. And we hear the echo of a question that stretches across millennia. What gets remembered? Who decides what makes the records? What about the stories that don't fit the narrative? The ninth didn't get statues. They got erasure. But, in a way, that made them immortal. Because their absence speaks louder than Rome's propaganda. Because in the end, the forgotten are often more honest than the glorified. Because we're still asking about them, long after the emperors who sent them north have crumbled into dust. So let this be their monument, a whispered name in the fog, a legend that outlived the bureaucracy, a crack in the marble illusion of empire, and a reminder that the greatest stories are sometimes the ones we'll never fully understand. Not because they weren't written, but because they were erased, and we chose to remember anyway.